She sets the table again. He's late. Again. But she calls it patience. She calls it love. The candles burn lower, wax pooling like tears on expensive wood, and still she waits. Her reflection in the wine glass shows a woman who has forgotten her own face, replaced by the careful architecture of hope. She adjusts the napkin for the 7th time, smooths her dress, checks her phone. Nothing. The silence in the room grows thick like blood, but she breathes it in and calls it devotion. This is the woman who bleeds for love and mistakes the hemorrhaging for loyalty. She is everywhere and nowhere, sitting at tables set for ghosts, holding conversations with shadows, making love to the idea of being chosen. She has been trained since childhood to believe that love is earned through suffering, that devotion is measured by how much pain you can swallow without making a sound. Watch her closely. See how she moves through the world like a woman carrying invisible wounds, how she speaks in whispers even when she should roar, how she apologizes for taking up space while simultaneously filling every crack in everyone else's broken foundation. She is the woman who says, "I'm fine," when she's drowning, who smiles when she's screaming inside, who gives her last breath to keep someone else's flame alive. Her mother did the same, stayed, served, smiled, and faded. Generation after generation of women who learned that love meant disappearing slowly, gracefully, without complaint. They passed down the sacred ritual of self-erasure like a family heirloom, polished with tears and wrapped in the beautiful lie that suffering sanctifies love. She was never taught love. She was trained to bleed quietly and call it loyalty. In the cathedral of her childhood, she learned to kneel before the altar of other people's needs, to offer up her own desires like burnt offerings, to find holiness in hunger and sacredness in sacrifice. Love, she learned, was not something you received. It was something you earned through the currency of your own diminishment. The first time she felt the sharp edge of emotional abandonment, she was 7 years old. Her father's attention was a lighthouse beam that swept past her, illuminating everything else while leaving her in darkness. She learned to dance in that darkness, to make herself smaller so the light might find her, to become so useful, so agreeable, so perfectly crafted to his specifications that surely he would see her. But he never did, and neither did the men who came after him, each one a variation on the same theme of emotional absence. She collected them like broken mirrors, each one reflecting back her own fragmentation, each one requiring her to become someone else in order to be worthy of their inconsistent love. She became fluent in the language of emotional starvation. She learned to read the subtle signs of withdrawal, the micro-expressions of disapproval, the silence that meant she had failed again to be enough. She developed an internal radar system that could detect the slightest shift in emotional weather, and she shaped herself accordingly, becoming a human barometer for other people's moods. This is the woman who loves like a storm trying to fill a desert, who pours herself out completely, and wonders why she remains empty, who gives her heart like a suicide note and calls it romance. She has confused intensity with intimacy, chaos with passion, and the desperate need to be needed with the profound experience of being loved. She tells herself stories to make sense of the pain. He's afraid of love because he's been hurt before. He's unavailable because he's protecting himself. He's cruel because he doesn't know how to be vulnerable. She becomes the translator of his emotional violence, the interpreter of his neglect, the faithful chronicler of his potential rather than the witness to his reality. In the theater of her mind, she is always the supporting character in someone else's story of transformation. She is the woman who will love him so purely, so completely, that he will finally understand his own worth. She is the healer who will fix what others have broken, the patient gardener who will tend to the wasteland of his heart until it blooms. But gardens require soil, and she has been giving him sand. Gardens require water, and she has been offering him her own blood. She has been trying to grow roses in a cemetery, wondering why everything she plants dies, why everything she touches withers, why love feels like a beautiful form of dying. She looks in the mirror and sees a stranger wearing her face, Where did she go? When did she become this careful, calculating creature who measures her worth by someone else's ability to love her? When did she start believing that her value was negotiable, that her needs were optional, that her pain was the price of admission to love? The woman in the mirror has eyes that have seen too much, hands that have given too much, a heart that has forgiven too much. She has become an expert in the art of emotional contortion, able to twist herself into any shape that might fit into the spaces others have left empty. She has learned to make herself smaller, quieter, more convenient, more palatable. But tonight, something shifts. Tonight, as she sits at the table set for two and occupied by one, as the candles burn down to nothing and the wine grows warm and bitter, something ancient and wild stirs in her chest. It is the voice of the woman she was before she learned to bleed quietly, before she learned to call her own destruction devotion. You weren't born to bleed for someone's absence. You were born to recognize your presence. You weren't created to be the supporting character in someone else's story of growth. You weren't designed to be the wound that someone else gets to heal from. You weren't meant to be the sacrifice that makes someone else feel holy. The realization hits her like lightning in reverse, not splitting her apart but putting her back together. She understands now that what she has been calling love was actually a form of slow suicide. What she has been calling loyalty was actually a betrayal of her own soul. What she has been calling devotion was actually a desperate attempt to earn something that cannot be earned. She stands up from the table, blows out the candles, and pours the wine down the drain. She is not waiting anymore. She is not bleeding anymore. She is not calling it love anymore. Tonight, she begins the long journey back to herself, back to the woman who knew her own worth before she learned to give it away, back to the fierce and tender creature who understood that love was not something you bled for, but something you bloomed from. The table will remain empty tomorrow, but she will be full. There are 5 shadows that dance in the unconscious mind of every woman who bleeds for love. 5 traits that masquerade as virtues while slowly poisoning the well of her own soul. These are not flaws to be ashamed of. They are survival mechanisms that have outlived their purpose, protective strategies that have become prisons, gifts that have been weaponized against the giver. Watch how she moves through the world, this woman who has forgotten her own name. See how she carries herself like an apology. How she speaks like someone asking permission to exist. How she loves like someone trying to prove she deserves to be loved. She has been shaped by forces she doesn't understand, driven by compulsions she cannot name, trapped in patterns that feel like destiny, but are actually choice. The first shadow that haunts her is the weight of the world on her shoulders. She became the backbone of every man and forgot her own spine. Over-responsibility flows through her veins like poison disguised as medicine. She looks at broken things and sees projects, at wounded people and sees missions, at chaos and sees her calling. She has confused her capacity to care with her obligation to carry everything. This woman enters relationships like a contractor, surveying a construction site. She sees the cracks in his foundation and rolls up her sleeves. She notices his inability to manage his emotions and quietly becomes his emotional regulator. She observes his lack of direction and subtly begins steering his ship. She witnesses his failures and starts succeeding on his behalf. She has become the invisible infrastructure that holds up his visible life. Jung understood this pattern as the compulsion to repair the absent father, to heal the wounded masculine that first broke her heart. She projects onto every man the potential for wholeness while systematically dismantling her own. She gives him her strength so he can feel strong, her clarity so he can feel wise, her stability so he can feel secure. She has become the mother to her own lover, the therapist to her own husband, the manager to her own partner. But responsibility that belongs to others will always be too heavy for one person to carry. She breaks her back lifting weights that were never meant for her arms. She exhausts herself running races that were never meant for her legs. She loses her voice speaking words that were never meant for her mouth. She has become responsible for his happiness, his growth, his choices, his consequences, his very existence while slowly becoming irresponsible for her own. The second shadow whispers that love is measured by suffering endured in silence. She wears her pain like perfume. No one sees it, but it consumes her. Silent endurance has become her signature, her calling card, her twisted form of currency in the economy of love. She has been taught that good women suffer beautifully, that strong women bleed quietly, that worthy women disappear gracefully. This is the woman who says, "I'm fine," when she's falling apart, who smiles when she wants to scream, who nods when she wants to run. She has become a master of emotional invisibility, able to hide her pain so completely that even she forgets it exists. She has learned to swallow her needs like bitter medicine, to digest her disappointments like daily bread, to breathe her grief like ordinary air. She measures her love by how much she can endure without complaint. The more she suffers, the more she loves. The more she sacrifices, the more she cares. The more she disappears, the more she proves her worth. She has confused endurance with love, tolerance with devotion, silence with strength. She has become the martyr in her own love story, the victim in her own fairy tale, the ghost in her own life. But love was never meant to be a test of how much pain you can withstand. Devotion was never meant to be measured by the depth of your wounds. Loyalty was never meant to cost you your voice, your needs, your very existence. She has been loving like someone trying to prove she deserves to be loved, giving like someone trying to earn the right to receive, suffering like someone trying to purchase paradise with her own pain. The third shadow intoxicates her with the drug of potential. She's not in love with him. She's in love with the man he might become. Hope addiction courses through her bloodstream like a beautiful poison, keeping her alive and killing her simultaneously. She has become addicted to the fantasy of his transformation, the possibility of his awakening, the potential of his love. This woman lives in the future tense. She loves him not for who he is, but for who he could be. She stays not because of what exists, but because of what might exist. She gives not because of what she receives, but because of what she imagines she might receive. She has become a romantic archaeologist, always digging for signs of the man buried beneath the surface, always excavating evidence of the love hidden in his actions. She collects his moments of tenderness like rare coins, hoarding them against the poverty of his everyday indifference. She magnifies his small gestures into grand declarations, his brief attentions into eternal promises, his temporary changes into permanent transformations. She has become fluent in the language of maybe, the dialect of someday, the poetry of if only. Jung recognized this as the inflation of the anima, the projection of the idealized masculine onto a man who cannot possibly contain it. She has made him the carrier of her own unrealized dreams, the vessel for her own unexpressed power, the savior in her own story of redemption. She has fallen in love with her own projection and called it his potential. But potential is not a person. Maybe is not a relationship. Someday is not a destination. She has been loving a ghost, dating a dream, married to a mirage. She has been faithful to a fantasy while being unfaithful to reality. She has been loyal to who he might become while betraying who she actually is. The fourth shadow masquerades as loyalty but is actually terror. She stays not because it's safe, but because she fears who she'll be alone. Fear of abandonment has dressed itself up as devotion. Terror of solitude has disguised itself as commitment. Horror of independence has masqueraded as love. She has confused her need to be needed with her capacity to love. This woman clings to relationships like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Not because the wood is solid, but because the water is terrifying. She has identified so completely with being someone's other half that she has forgotten how to be whole. She has defined herself so entirely by her ability to love others that she has no idea who she is when she's not loving someone. She stays in relationships that starve her because she believes that hunger is better than emptiness. She endures treatment that diminishes her because she believes that being small is better than being alone. She accepts love that hurts her because she believes that pain is better than absence. She has become afraid of her own company, terrified of her own thoughts, horrified by her own solitude. Jung understood this as the identification with the animus, the masculine principle within her that she has projected onto external men, rather than integrating within herself. She has given away her own inner masculine, her own strength, her own direction, her own power, and then desperately needs a man to give it back to her. She has become emotionally dependent on others to feel whole, psychologically dependent on others to feel real, spiritually dependent on others to feel worthy. But the love that comes from fear is not love at all. The loyalty that comes from terror is not loyalty at all. The devotion that comes from desperation is not devotion at all. She has been loving from emptiness rather than fullness, from poverty rather than abundance, from fear rather than freedom. The fifth and final shadow completes the circle of self-destruction. She disappears piece by piece, just to hear him say, "You're enough." Self-erasure for validation has become her specialty, her art form, her twisted way of loving. She has learned to make herself smaller so others can feel bigger, to make herself less so others can feel more, to make herself nothing so others can feel everything. This woman has become a magician of disappearance. She can vanish her own needs, her own desires, her own dreams, her own opinions, her own very self, all for the applause of being chosen. She has learned to edit herself like a manuscript, cutting out everything that might be too much, too loud, too real, too her. She has become the curator of her own diminishment, the architect of her own absence, the author of her own disappearance. She measures her worth by how little space she takes up, how few needs she has, how easily she can be overlooked. She has confused being agreeable with being lovable, being convenient with being valuable, being invisible with being good. She has made herself so small that she has become impossible to love, not because she is unworthy, but because she is no longer there. But you cannot love someone who isn't there. You cannot choose someone who has already chosen to disappear. You cannot see someone who has made themselves invisible. She has been trying to earn love by becoming unlovable, to gain attention by becoming invisible, to be chosen by becoming no one at all. These 5 shadows, over-responsibility, silent endurance, hope addiction, fear of abandonment, and self-erasure, work together like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of self-destruction. They convince her that love is something she must earn through suffering, that devotion is something she must prove through disappearance, that loyalty is something she must demonstrate through the sacrifice of her own soul. But she is waking up now. She is beginning to see the shadows for what they are. She is starting to understand that what she has been calling love was actually a form of slow suicide. What she has been calling loyalty was actually a betrayal of her own essence. What she has been calling devotion was actually a desperate attempt to purchase something that cannot be bought. The woman who bleeds for love is dying, and in her death something new is being born. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she must choose between the familiar pain of self-betrayal and the unknown territory of self-love. It is the moment when she realizes that loyalty that costs her soul is not love. It is a contract with emptiness. It is the moment when she understands that she doesn't need to be chosen to be worthy. She needs to choose to stop bleeding. This is the moment of individuation, the sacred process Jung described as becoming whole. It is not about finding the right person to complete her. It is about becoming complete enough to recognize when someone is worthy of her completeness. It is not about learning to love better. It is about learning to love from fullness rather than emptiness, from abundance rather than scarcity, from choice rather than compulsion. Watch her now as she stands at the threshold between who she was and who she is becoming. See how she holds herself differently, how she breathes differently, how she moves through the world like someone who has remembered something precious that was lost. She is no longer the woman who sets tables for ghosts. She is no longer the woman who bleeds for love and calls it loyalty. She is becoming the woman who understands that the deepest devotion is the one she owes to herself. The transformation begins with a single act of rebellion against her own conditioning. She looks at herself in the mirror, and instead of seeing someone who needs to be fixed, improved, or made more acceptable, She sees someone who has been wounded by the very attempt to become acceptable. She sees someone who has been trying so hard to be worthy of love that she forgot she was born worthy. She begins to understand that the love she has been seeking outside herself has been living inside her all along, waiting patiently for her to come home. She realizes that she has been looking for herself in other people's eyes, searching for her own reflection in other people's approval, trying to find her own worth in other people's validation. She has been the treasure she was seeking, the answer she was questioning, the love she was begging for. The process of reclaiming herself is not gentle. It is not a soft, peaceful journey of self-discovery. It is a fierce, sometimes brutal excavation of her own truth from beneath the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. She must dig through decades of being told she was too much, too little, too loud, too quiet, too sensitive, too harsh. She must unearth the wild, untamed woman who was buried alive under the weight of other people's needs. She begins to notice the voice that has been whispering to her all along, the voice of her own inner wisdom, her own intuition, her own knowing. It is the voice that always told her when something was wrong, when someone was lying, when a situation was toxic. It is the voice she learned to silence, to doubt, to override with the louder voices of obligation and duty, and the desperate need to be loved. She starts to listen to this voice again. She starts to trust her own perception, her own feelings, her own instincts. She realizes that she has been gaslighting herself, convincing herself that her pain was unreasonable, that her needs were too much, that her boundaries were selfish. She begins to understand that her sensitivity was not a weakness, but a strength, that her intuition was not paranoia, but protection, that her standards were not impossibly high, but appropriately sacred. The woman who used to disappear piece by piece now begins to reappear. She remembers her own opinions, her own preferences, her own dreams. She recalls what she used to love before she learned to love through other people, what she used to want before she learned to want through other people's desires, who she used to be before she learned to be through other people's expectations. She discovers that she has been living in a house of mirrors, seeing herself only through the reflections of other people's perceptions. She has been so busy being what others needed her to be that she forgot what she needed herself to be. She has been so focused on earning love that she forgot how to give it to herself. The process of individuation requires her to face her own shadow, not just the ways she has been wounded, but the ways she has participated in her own wounding. She must acknowledge that she chose to stay in situations that starved her, that she chose to accept treatment that diminished her, that she chose to love people who could not love her back. She must take responsibility not for what was done to her, but for what she allowed to continue being done to her. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the journey, the recognition that she was not just a victim of others' inability to love her properly, but a co-conspirator in her own diminishment. She must face the uncomfortable truth that she taught people how to treat her by what she was willing to accept, that she participated in her own invisibility by making herself small, that she contributed to her own abandonment by abandoning herself first. But with this recognition comes power. If she participated in creating her own suffering, she can also participate in creating her own healing. If she taught people how to treat her badly, she can teach them how to treat her well. If she abandoned herself, she can come back to herself. The same power that created her prison can create her freedom. She begins to set boundaries, not walls to keep people out, but sacred spaces to keep her soul safe. She learns to say no without explanation, to want without justification, to exist without permission. She discovers that boundaries are not selfish but essential, not harsh but holy, not barriers to love but gateways to authentic connection. The woman who used to overfunction in relationships now begins to function appropriately. She stops carrying other people's emotional baggage and starts carrying her own dreams. She stops managing other people's lives and starts managing her own energy. She stops being responsible for other people's happiness and starts being responsible for her own wholeness. She realizes that she has been trying to love others into wholeness while remaining fragmented herself. She has been trying to give from an empty cup while wondering why she always felt drained. She has been trying to light others' fires while her own flame was dying. She understands now that she cannot give what she does not have, cannot offer what she has not cultivated, cannot love others fully until she has learned to love herself completely. The process of learning to love herself is foreign and familiar simultaneously. It is foreign because she has never done it before, and familiar because it is what she has been longing for her entire life. She begins to treat herself with the same tenderness she showed others, to speak to herself with the same kindness she offered friends, to care for herself with the same devotion she gave to unworthy lovers. She creates rituals of self-love, not the superficial kind that involves bubble baths and face masks, but the deep structural kind that involves choosing herself even when it's difficult, honoring her own needs even when others disapprove, protecting her own energy even when people call her selfish. She learns to be her own best friend, her own fierce protector, her own loving companion. The woman who used to seek validation outside herself now begins to validate herself. She learns to celebrate her own victories, to comfort her own sorrows, to encourage her own dreams. She discovers that the approval she was seeking from others was always available from within, that the love she was begging for was always residing in her own heart, that the wholeness she was trying to achieve through others was always her natural state. She begins to understand that individuation is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming who she has always been beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. It is about returning to the wild, untamed woman who knew her own worth before she learned to doubt it, who trusted her own wisdom before she learned to question it, who loved her own company before she learned to fear it. The transformation is not without grief. She mourns the years she lost bleeding for love, the energy she wasted on people who could not receive her gifts, the pieces of herself she gave away to those who did not treasure them. She grieves the woman she used to be, not because she was bad, but because she was incomplete. She honors the journey that brought her here while releasing the patterns that no longer serve her. As she continues to individuate, she notices that her capacity for love has not diminished. It has deepened. She can love more purely now because she loves from wholeness rather than emptiness. She can give more generously now because she gives from abundance rather than scarcity. She can connect more authentically now because she connects from truth rather than fear. The woman who used to attract broken people now attracts whole people. The woman who used to accept crumbs now expects feasts. The woman who used to settle for potential now demands reality. She has become a magnet for the kind of love she has learned to give herself, conscious, reciprocal, nourishing, and real. She understands now that loyalty ends where self-love begins, that true devotion is not about sacrificing herself for others, but about becoming someone worthy of her own devotion, that the deepest commitment she can make is not to someone else, but to her own growth, her own healing, her own becoming. She looks back at the woman she used to be with compassion rather than judgment, with understanding rather than shame. She sees that woman as someone who was doing the best she could with the tools she had, someone who was trying to love in the only way she knew how, someone who deserved better than she knew how to ask for. But she is not that woman anymore. She is the woman who chose to stop bleeding. She is the woman who chose to start living. She is the woman who realized that the love she was seeking was always within her reach. She just had to reach inward instead of outward. She just had to come home to herself instead of trying to find herself in someone else. The woman who bleeds for love is dead. Long live the woman who loves from wholeness.